Good evening, wherever you may be listening to this story from around the world. If you've started this video when the room has grown quiet, when the lights have softened, when a long day has finally begun to loosen its grip on you, then you are exactly where you need to be. Before we begin, allow yourself a very brief pause. Adjust your headphones. Shift your body just slightly. Let your shoulders drop and allow the outside world to come to a temporary standstill. Tonight, we will not speak of battles. We will not chase sensational conspiracies. We will not hunt for shocking secrets. Instead, we will speak of something far quieter: silence. In the Victorian British royal family, power rarely appeared in the form of commands. It did not need to shout. It did not need to threaten. It did not need to explain itself. Power lived elsewhere. It existed in the distance between two people standing in conversation, in who was invited and who was not, in the room where a sentence was allowed to be spoken aloud, and the room where that very same sentence would never be uttered. This story is a journey through quiet palaces, through audiences governed by perfect order, through private letters never meant to be read aloud. It is not a journey of judgment, nor of quick conclusions, but of observation, as if you were passing gently through history after everything has fallen asleep. And before we continue, I want to ask you one very soft question. If power does not need to speak, then what truly makes people obey? In the Victorian world, power rarely appeared as a clear command. It did not knock at the door with a clenched fist. It did not enter a room carried by a raised voice or by threats. It arrived earlier than that, and it remained longer than that. Power was present even before people realized that they were standing before it. It was there, quiet, prepared, built layer by layer, through ritual, through distance, through habits repeated so consistently that no one could remember when they had begun or why they were still being followed. There was no clear moment of origin for these habits. There was no day on which the court declared, from today onward, we will bow like this, stand in that position, remain silent in certain rooms. Everything formed slowly. A gesture was repeated because it felt right. A distance was maintained because it seemed appropriate. A silence was preserved because no one wished to be the first to break it. And over time, all of these elements bound together into an invisible network, an order that required no written law, yet proved stronger than law itself. Power in that era did not need to announce itself. It did not need to say, "I am power." It only needed to exist long enough to become the background, like the light in a room, like the ticking of a wall clock, like the thick carpet beneath one's feet. You do not notice them yet. Every movement you make is shaped by their presence. You walk more slowly. You lower your voice. You weigh your words more carefully before speaking, not because someone is watching, but because the space itself has taught you how to behave. And if there was any crown that truly carried weight in that era, it was not a crown of gold, not a glittering symbol resting on the head of a particular individual. It was an invisible crown placed upon the entire life of the court, the crown of silence. It did not press upon the neck. It pressed upon behavior. It did not cause immediate pain. It created familiarity. A familiarity dangerous in one crucial way. Once people grew accustomed to it, they no longer thought of removing it. That crown was worn every day by everyone, even by those who never came near the throne. It appeared in the way a person waited outside a door, in the way a gaze was lowered, at precisely the right moment, in the way a sentence was swallowed before it could become speech. And because no one named it, because no one challenged it, the crown grew heavier with each passing year. Heavy, not because of pressure, but because of time. In that world, power did not need to win. It only needed to continue. And silence repeated long enough became the most durable material from which the entire Victorian order was built. Imagine an audience at court. The doors open. Light enters at a carefully calculated angle. The person who steps inside stops at exactly the right position, not marked by paint or metal, but by the collective memory of the court. No one points. No one signals. Everyone knows where they must stand. And in that moment, no words are required for power to be present. It is already there, complete, intact, accepted as naturally as air. What made the Victorian era distinctive was not the sheer number of its rituals, nor the intricacy of their design. It was not that there were more ceremonies than in other periods, but that ritual gradually replaced speech. Ritual assumed the role that in earlier eras had belonged to command's decrees or openly declared authority. In the Victorian world, it was no longer necessary to state what must be done, because ritual had already done that work quietly and patiently. Within a constitutional monarchy, where executive power no longer rested entirely in royal hands, where decisions were drafted, signed, debated, and revised in Parliament, the role of the monarchy appeared from the outside to have been softened. The Queen did not issue military orders. The royal family did not directly administer the treasury or the law. On paper, everything was clearly divided, rational, and modern. Yet within that division, a new void emerged, and ritual moved in to fill it. The softness of the royal role was not retreat. It was transformation. Power no longer needed to appear as coercion, because coercion always invites resistance. Instead, power learned to hide within form, within rhythm, within things that were always done this way. When something is repeated long enough, people stop asking why. And when there are no longer questions, power no longer needs to defend or justify itself. Ritual in this context became a substitute language. It used no words. It did not argue. It did not explain. Yet it communicated with absolute clarity what needed to be understood: who stands in front and who stands behind, who may speak and who should remain silent, what is permitted to appear and what must remain behind closed doors. A bow at the right moment, a pause held just long enough, a route of movement never altered, each spoke in place of hundreds of sentences. Within the Victorian court, there were very few moments when power needed to reveal itself openly. It did not need to prove that it was the center, because everything around it had already been arranged to revolve around it. When a space, a schedule, and a social order are shaped in this way, power need only exist without speaking, without signaling, and people will automatically adjust their behavior to fit. This was not a weakening of power, it was its maturation. For this reason, the Victorian era marked a quiet turning point in the history of power. Not the collapse of monarchy, but its restructuring. Power shifted from commanding to shaping, from saying, "Do this," to making people believe this is what should be done. In that process, ritual became the perfect instrument, formal enough to sustain authority, ambiguous enough to avoid challenge, and familiar enough to be accepted as a natural part of life. That softness from the surface may have resembled concession, but beneath it lay a strategy of survival. By not appearing as power, power avoided direct confrontation. By clothing itself in tradition, morality, and order, it extended its influence across generations. And when people ceased to see power as an opposing force, they began to live alongside it, sometimes even to protect it, without realizing that they were doing so. This is why in the Victorian era, power could be both quiet and enduring. It did not need to raise its voice. It only needed to continue existing in the form of ritual and allow ritual to speak in place of everything words no longer needed to say. Because when something becomes habit, it is no longer questioned. When a gesture is repeated long enough, it no longer requires explanation. And when an order is maintained with sufficient consistency, it no longer needs to justify itself. The Victorian age understood this, and the court turned that understanding into an art. Within those rooms, very little was permitted to happen by chance. Time was divided, distance measured in footsteps, gazes were controlled, voices were lowered before they could become too distinct. Not because anyone forbade it, but because everyone had learned to self-regulate. This was the crucial point. Power no longer needed to compel. It only needed to shape the environment so that people would willingly bend themselves to it. If this story were told as a myth, and in many ways it truly is, then ritual would be the spell. It does not create magic, it creates order. And within that order, everyone knows their place. No one needs to ask. No one requires confirmation. A bow made at the right rhythm can say more than an entire speech. A step backward, taken at the right moment, can determine the course of a relationship. And a silence held long enough can end an argument before it ever begins. There is a distinctly Victorian paradox at work here. The less that is said, the clearer power becomes. The less that is displayed, the deeper its influence runs. Words can be recorded, challenged, reinterpreted. Ritual cannot. It does not debate. It does not need to be right or wrong. It is simply done, and through being done, it becomes the operating truth. Observe how people enter a space of power. Before they are aware of it, their shoulders lower. Their breathing slows. The words they were about to speak retreat back into the throat. No one orders them to do this. There are no signs, no written laws. Yet the body knows. The body always knows. And the Victorian world trusted this, that if space is shaped with enough precision, the human body will complete the remaining work on its own. Within the court, some things were named, and some things were never named at all. Not because they were secrets, but because naming them would expose the mechanism itself. One does not say this is power because power weakens when it must introduce itself. One does not say this is influence because the strongest influence is the kind that convinces others they are deciding freely. And one does not say this is control because the most effective control is the kind accepted as self-evident. During audiences, this can be felt like a very thin mist. It does not block vision. It does not make breathing difficult, yet it is present. And you move more slowly, more carefully, as if something fragile were suspended in the air, an invisible order that could be disrupted by a single mistimed gesture. The Victorian age did not create this order overnight. It was built over years through repetition, through generations who learned to observe before acting, to remain silent before speaking. To understand that in certain spaces, not speaking is itself a powerful form of speech. Gradually, ritual became the primary language, a language without vocabulary, without grammar, yet understood by all. If you look back at the paintings and early photographs of that era, you will find very little emotion on display. Neutral faces, upright posture, eyes turned slightly away from the viewer. Not because people lacked emotion, but because emotion was not permitted to become the center. The center was order. The center was continuity. The center was the sense that everything was unfolding exactly as it should, even if no one could clearly explain what should meant. And this is where the crown of silence reveals its true weight. It does not press upon the head. It presses upon behavior. It does not cause pain. It creates familiarity. It renders choices so obvious that people forget there were ever other options. In that space, power does not need to win because no conflict is allowed to begin. Perhaps if one listens long enough, one comes to realize that what is most unsettling is not repression, but smoothness. A system that operates so seamlessly that no one thinks to stop and ask, why? And the Victorian world, with its thick carpets, heavy doors, rigid schedules, and meticulous rituals, achieved precisely that level of smoothness. Tonight, as you allow this story to slow even further, try to feel silence as a character. It does not speak. It does not appear, yet it shapes everything around it. It is what remains after words have faded, after the lights have gone out, after the room has returned to its gentle darkness. And within that darkness, power is still there without speaking, without proving itself, simply continuing. When the doors of the audience chamber close, there is no loud sound. Only a very soft click, just enough to signal that order remains intact. No applause, no declaration of conclusion. People depart along the routes they have memorized, and the invisible crown, the crown of silence, continues to rest upon everyone, heavy yet familiar, heavy yet no longer felt. And that is how our story begins, not with trumpets, not with proclamations, but with a quiet room where power has learned its most important lesson. When it does not need to be spoken, it will endure longer. It is not the movement of emotion, but the movement of a machine, slow, steady, precise, and almost never stopping. Imagine a Victorian court morning beginning not with sunlight slipping through curtains, nor with the sound of a city waking, but with a schedule. Not a single sheet of paper, but an entire system of time, divided, marked, and remembered. Before anyone in the royal family appears before the public, before a great door is opened, before a single footstep is heard on the thick carpet, dozens of people have already risen very early, while the sky has not yet had time to change color. They rise not to wonder what the day will be like, nor to weigh choices. In this world, choices have been made in advance. They rise to carry out what has already been decided, to continue a chain of tasks that existed yesterday, last week, many years ago. Each person knows their portion of the work without needing to be reminded, without needing explanation. One checks the time, one prepares the space, one reviews the list of names, one ensures that everything will be in the correct place when it is needed, neither earlier nor later. None of them pauses to ask why their work matters. In this machine, importance does not belong to the individual. It belongs to continuity. Every task, no matter how small, is placed exactly where it must be within a long sequence of connected actions, like gears meshing, turning quietly, requiring no gaze, no praise. If one gear turns even a fraction too slowly, the entire system feels the misalignment. And so everyone learns to keep the rhythm not fast, not slow, only precise enough that their own existence does not reveal itself. That morning unfolds in a silence that is unmistakably its own. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of concentration. Footsteps are measured so they do not echo too loudly. Doors are opened with exactly the right force. Any exchanges of words, if they happen at all, are kept to the smallest amount necessary. Every excess sound is a risk, a sign that something has not been arranged perfectly. In that atmosphere, time does not drift freely. It is managed. Each minute has its place. Each gap has a reason to exist. If there is waiting, it is not waste, but part of the design. Waiting at the right moment is a skill, and in the Victorian court, that skill is refined until it becomes instinct. When light finally appears, it does not change the morning's rhythm. Everything continues as it has already been set. Sunlight falls only upon what is already ready to receive it. And by the time the royal family steps before the public, the scene is complete. No one sees the silent hours of labor behind it. No one hears the first footsteps in the dark. They see only the result, an image of order, of stability, as though it has always existed. And that is the purpose of mourning in the Victorian court. Not to begin a new day, but to maintain an old one, a day so familiar it does not need to be noticed, a day in which the machine keeps turning, because there are people who have learned to rise early, not to live for themselves, but to keep the entire system running smoothly, quietly, steadily, and never needing to be named. From a distance, the court resembles an extended family. From within, it resembles an administrative apparatus more than any government office. There are lists, there are ledgers, there are ranks, there are divisions of authority. There are tasks repeated so daily that they no longer carry any personal imprint. And it is precisely this repetition that creates the sensation of stability, the sensation that everything is under control, even when no one says so. What few Victorians and even fewer people later tend to mention is that the monarchy cannot survive on symbols alone. Symbols require logistics. They require someone to arrange the chairs before an audience begins, someone to check the route before a door is opened, someone to record who arrived, who was absent, who stood closer than usual, and who was pushed one step farther back than last time. Not to accuse, only to remember. And in the Victorian court, memory is stored more carefully than emotion. Every audience, every movement, every event, large or small, leaves a paper trail. Not because the court doubts itself, but because the machine runs smoothly only when everything can be traced backward. Who prepared it? Who approved it? Who bears responsibility if something is not up to standard? Those questions are rarely spoken aloud, but they are always present quietly in the way work is divided. There is a paradox at the heart of this machine, a paradox that reveals itself only if you look slowly enough. The less direct power there is, the more organization is required. When the monarchy no longer issues orders, no longer declares what must be done at once, everything around it is forced to reach a different kind of perfection. Perfection so complete that no order is needed at all. In the Victorian world, an order is never a sign of strength. On the contrary, an order often signals that the system has failed somewhere. If something must be spoken, it means something has not been prepared thoroughly enough. And so, the court learns to work in reverse to prepare in advance for everything that might happen, so that the decisive moment can pass without anyone needing to speak. The schedule, therefore, becomes the backbone of power. Not a calendar meant to remind, but a calendar meant to shape behavior. Time does not merely announce when an event begins. It governs the breathing rhythm of an entire day. Every interval is calculated not only according to need, but according to the possibility of error. How many extra minutes must be allowed for movement? How many seconds for a door to open? How long is enough for a room to settle before someone enters? These questions are answered long before that day even begins. Space, too, is never accidental. An empty room is not a void. It is part of the design. Each object is placed precisely to guide the eye, to regulate movement, and to prevent unwanted situations. Space is prepared not to decorate, but to reduce the need for intervention. When everything is in the right place, people will automatically do what is expected without anyone needing to remind them. And people, perhaps the most crucial element, are trained not to speculate, but to respond with accuracy. Not to respond quickly, but to respond correctly in the right rhythm, in the right role, at the right degree of presence. They learn to recognize the smallest signals, a shift in tone, a pause held a little longer than usual, the slightest adjustment in the order of appearance. These signals are never announced as rules, yet anyone who works long enough understands that missing them can throw an entire sequence of ritual out of alignment. To make all of this run smoothly, the Victorian court builds a dense network of personnel layered over one another, like invisible padding. These people do not appear in portraits. Their names are rarely mentioned in official chronicles. They do not represent the reign, yet without them, no ritual could begin, no audience could end properly, no image of stability could be maintained. They are the ones who stand between the gears, not to become the focus, but to ensure the gears do not strike each other. They exist to absorb error, to correct small misalignments before they become noticeable. And because they do their work so well that they are nearly invisible, they are acknowledged less and less. In this machine, invisibility is the mark of success. That paradox, fewer commands yet more organization, is the key to understanding why the Victorian court could endure so steadily. Power no longer needs to be exercised in a single moment. It is dispersed, broken down, and sunk deep into the structure. And when the structure is strong enough, power need only be present without issuing orders, because everything has already been arranged to operate in the way it desires. They are the ones who know when to open a door and when to wait a few more seconds, who know when a delay is harmless and when it signals something larger. They know that a small change in the order of greeting can send a message more forceful than any speech. In that world, power does not lie in deciding what happens, but in deciding the sequence in which things happen. And sequence once established is difficult to break. No one needs to tell you that you are late if an entire room goes quiet when you enter. No one needs to say you have lost your position if you find yourself standing a little farther back than before. The royal machine does not punish, it adjusts. And its adjustments are so subtle that those within it often do not realize they have been moved onto a different orbit. In the Victorian court, everyone is part of the machine, including the royal family. This is the hardest truth for anyone who imagines power as something purely personal. Yet the reality is that when a system becomes large enough and stable enough, the individual must follow its rhythm. The schedule does not wait for emotion. Ritual does not bend to mood. And the machine does not stop simply because a person needs more time to breathe. There are days when the court runs so smoothly that it is almost invisible. Everything happens on time. There are no incidents, no meaningful errors. Those are the days when the machine is strongest, because when nothing breaks, no one notices the structure behind it. People see only the result, stability, solemnity, the sense that everything is exactly where it belongs. And that sense, once familiar, becomes the foundation of belief. But every machine needs energy. In this case, the energy does not come from steam or coal. It comes from compliance, from each person accepting their role without needing constant reminders, from understanding that their work, however small, contributes to a larger order. And when people believe in that order, they work not only out of responsibility, but out of meaning. That is when the machine becomes most durable, when it no longer needs to compel, because those who run it have internalized the rules. They know what is proper without consulting anything. They can feel when something is out of rhythm, even if no one says it aloud, and they adjust quietly, quickly, to return everything to the familiar track. In the Victorian world, the monarchy does not stand above the machine. It stands at the center of it, yet it is also bound by the very procedures that allow it to endure. An audience cannot be extended on impulse. A public appearance cannot be changed at the last minute without triggering a chain of adjustments behind the scenes. The machine is designed to minimize uncertainty, and in exchange, it demands absolute cooperation. Perhaps the least spoken truth about the Victorian court is not its luxury, but its labor, invisible labor, mental labor, emotional labor, the labor of people who learn to leave no personal trace in the work they do. They do not seek recognition. They seek smoothness. And in a system where smoothness is the measure of success, that is the highest level of the craft. When night falls and the great rooms gradually grow silent, the machine does not stop. It merely shifts into another rhythm, slower, more discreet, and even harder to see. The lights are lowered, but not fully extinguished. The long corridors become quiet, but not empty. Somewhere behind closed doors, work continues as silently as the steady breathing of a sleeping body. Paperwork is still arranged, not hurriedly, but with a patience that feels almost unfeeling. Pages that have been used are set aside. Pages that must be reviewed are marked with the lightest touch, just enough for tomorrow's reader to know they were once handled. There are no harsh strokes, no excess notes. Every trace is kept to a minimum, as though leaving too visible a trace would itself be a mistake. The schedule for the next day is reviewed line by line, gap by gap. Not to change the larger order, but to search for the smallest deviations, a possible overlap, an interval too tight, a movement that needs a few extra minutes of margin. These adjustments are rarely decisive, yet they prevent instability before it can even form. It is work without climax, without memorable moments, only the careful repetition of preventing anything from becoming noticeable. In that nocturnal rhythm, the machine operates as though it is checking itself. It does not wait until morning to discover errors. It searches for them while everything is quiet, while no one is watching, while correction needs no explanation. And it is this silent proactivity that makes the next morning unfold smoothly, as if nothing had ever needed to be touched at all. This is the system's cold beauty, a beauty that does not ask to be admired. The best work in this world is work no one realizes has been done. No one applauds a day in which nothing goes wrong. No one remembers the names of those who prevented a malfunction that never had the chance to appear. Success is measured in normality, in the feeling that everything happens exactly as it always has. And as the night deepens, as even the last footsteps disappear, the machine remains in a state of waiting, not asleep, not awake, only ready. Ready for morning to return it to the old rhythm with the same cold precision, so that the world can look at it and believe that this order is natural, self-evident, and not to be questioned. If you listen closely enough in that quiet, you can almost feel the machine's breathing steady, patient without emotion. It does not care about the individual. It cares about continuation. And it is through that continuation that the Victorian monarchy holds its place in a world changing faster than ever. Behind every solemn ritual, behind every moment that appears unchanging, there is a machine that never truly rests. A machine that does not need to be loved, only kept running. And in the Victorian world, that is precisely what is done day after day in silence, with a persistence so constant it feels almost unconscious. In the Victorian world, a palace is not a place to live. It is a place that changes the way a human being exists. Imagine yourself passing through the gate. Before you even realize it, your pace has already slowed. Not because anyone reminds you, but because the ground beneath your feet, wider, flatter, and quieter, has done that work for you. The distance between the walls stretches farther than is necessary for walking. The ceiling rises higher than is necessary for standing upright. From the beginning, the space is built to make you smaller, not in a humiliating sense, but in the sense of order. A Victorian palace does not display power through instant splendor. It does not need to overwhelm you with blinding gold, does not try to dominate you at first glance. Instead, it is more patient than that. What it reveals is not wealth, but proportion, a sensation difficult to name, yet almost impossible to avoid once you step inside. Everything is just slightly larger than the human body, ceilings higher than necessary to stand, doors wider than necessary to pass through, distances between walls longer than necessary to connect one point to another. That slightly more is not designed to shock. It is subtle enough that you may not notice it immediately, but your body does. The body always reacts before the mind has time to explain. You slow down without knowing why. You feel the need to keep your distance, though no one asks it of you. You realize this space was not built around your stride, does not bend itself to the dimensions of your body. And in that moment, something very important happens. You are no longer the center. When the body is no longer the center, behavior begins to change in a way that feels natural. Your shoulders lower, not from fatigue, but from an ancient reflex before a vast space. Your voice becomes softer, not from fear, but because sound in this room seems to carry a different weight. A sentence spoken here does not vanish quickly. It remains, it rebounds, it lingers, making you hesitate before you speak. And your gaze, almost by instinct, searches for a lower place to rest, not because anyone signals you, but because looking directly into that space demands a confidence you may not yet be ready to claim. The space makes you aware of your own body, your height, your breathing, each small movement. Every footstep becomes more distinct. Every gesture feels as though it is being registered, even when no eyes are watching. That is the power of proportion. It does not require a guard. It makes you guard yourself. In a Victorian palace, there is no meaningless excess. Empty stretches are not absence. They are tools. They force you to cross them. They force you to spend time. They force you to feel the length of a corridor, the height of a wall, the cold of stone beneath your hand. And in that span of time, while you walk, while you wait, your thinking slows down, spreads out, becomes easier to shape. You are no longer in a hurry to assert yourself. You begin to adapt to the rhythm of the space. There is something very subtle here. The palace does not make you feel oppressed. It does not make you feel small in an insulting way. It makes you feel that you are standing inside something larger than yourself, an order that existed before you arrived and will continue after you leave. Once you feel that you do not resist it, you adjust yourself to fit within it. And it is in that adjustment, gentle, almost unconscious, that power truly begins. Not at the throne, not in symbols, but in the moment a person lowers their voice, slows their steps, and accepts that in this space they are not the primary point of reference. In a Victorian palace, proportion is not only architecture, it is a wordless lesson repeated through every step until it becomes familiar feeling and therefore becomes truth. No one orders you to be silent. There are no signs, no rules posted on the wall. Yet silence appears as though it were a natural property of the space, because architecture has done what commands often cannot. It has adjusted reflex. The corridors in a Victorian palace do not merely connect rooms. They are extended to create time, time to wait, time to reconsider, time to feel that you are leaving one space and preparing to enter another with a different set of rules. Every transition is designed to erase haste, and when haste disappears, people become easier to guide, not by words, but by sensation. The doors in the palace do not merely open and close. They are heavy, not so heavy as to be unusable, but heavy enough that you must use both hands, heavy enough that each opening becomes a conscious act. And in that moment, when your hand meets a cold surface, when your body adjusts its force, you are pulled out of your own stream of thought. You are reminded without words that each next step requires caution. The audience chamber is where power reaches its purest form, not through speech, but through layout. Chairs are placed at distances already calculated not so close as to create intimacy, not so far as to create coldness. Light is directed so that it emphasizes the center without exposing unnecessary detail. Everything points toward one focal place, not to glorify an individual, but to reinforce a role. In those rooms, you rarely find perfect symmetry. There are slight deviations, very small, just enough to create the sense that a refined order is at work, an order not meant to be copied, but meant to be obeyed. That deviation reminds you that not everything can be predicted, and therefore you should observe before you act. In this way, the palace becomes a continuous lesson. You learn with your body, not with your mind. You learn while standing, while waiting, while walking. You learn to hold silence in places where silence seems to have existed long before you arrived. And when you leave, you carry that lesson with you, not as a clear memory, but as a subtle adjustment in the way you look at the world. There is something rarely stated the architecture of power does not need to terrify. It only needs to be consistent. When every room follows the same logic, when every corridor stretches with the same rhythm, when every empty space is used in the same way, people begin to believe that this is the only way a space can exist. And once that belief forms, power has completed the hardest part of its work. In the Victorian world, the palace does something else as well. It separates. Not only separating royalty from the public, but separating social states from one another. There are rooms you pass through only once. There are passageways you are never permitted to use. There are doors always in front of you, yet never opened for you. And the existence of those limits, whether or not you touch them, shapes the feeling of your position within the larger order. Strangely, those limits rarely need to be spoken. They are expressed in the height of a step, in the width of a passage, in the faint shift in the material of the floor. Your feet feel the difference before your mind has time to ask the question. And once the body understands, the question becomes unnecessary. The palace also controls the rhythm of appearance. No one steps into the center immediately. People move through outer rings, first spaces, less formal, less bright, before gradually approaching the core. Each ring closer is preparation, and by the time you stand in the most important place, you are ready to behave correctly, not because you were taught, but because the space has taught you without your noticing. At night, when the palace grows quiet, those spaces do not lose their power. If anything, they become clearer. In silence, you can feel proportion, distance, and arrangement with a different sharpness, as if stone and wood are still working, holding order, maintaining rhythm, waiting for people to return, so that the wordless lesson may continue. Perhaps that is what makes the architecture of power so enduring. It does not need people in order to exist. People come and go, reigns change, but the space remains, carrying the logic of a past age, continuing to shape the behavior of anyone who enters. And over time, that logic is treated as natural, as though space could only ever be built that way. In the Victorian world, a palace is not merely a symbol of power. It is an instrument of power, an instrument that does not wear down, does not resist, and does not need to be defended with words. It works slowly, patiently, effectively shaping human beings step by step, room by room. When you leave the palace, there is no clear moment of liberation waiting at the threshold. No door closes behind you with a decisive sign that its influence ends here. There is no sharp border between inside and outside that you can point to and say, from this moment, everything will be different. The transition happens quietly, almost imperceptibly, and precisely because of that, it is effective. You walk, and after only a few steps, you realize your pace is slightly faster. Not because you are rushing, but because the surrounding space now allows it. You speak a little louder, as though your voice finally has room to spread, without being held back by high ceilings and thick walls. You take a deeper breath, a full breath you did not realize you had been restraining. The sensation is light, yet undeniable, like taking off a heavy coat you have worn so long you have forgotten its weight. There is no moment inside the palace that makes you think, "This is when I am being influenced." Everything happens too smoothly, too naturally. Only when you leave does the difference reveal itself, not in thought, but in the body, in the way you stand a little straighter, in the way your shoulders loosen, in the way your gaze begins to lift, searching for the horizon rather than the familiar low resting point. And it is in that contrast between before and after, between inside and outside, that you begin to understand that the space has done something to you. Not through words, not through commands, but through prolonged experience. It has taught you how to move, how to wait, how to be present. And only once you are away from it do you realize you have been learning those lessons all along. The feeling is not dramatic. It does not provoke resistance or anger. It is like an aftersound, a small echo remaining after the main sound has faded. You cannot point to the exact moment inside the palace that caused the change. Yet you know it happened. And that very vagueness is the sign that the influence has gone deep. Spaces of power always work that way. They do not seek recognition. They do not want you to remember them as a force acting upon you. They want you to carry their result, a slight adjustment in behavior, a vague sense of order, a new habit in the way you exist. And when you carry those things out of the palace, power has crossed its own physical border. You continue walking into the wider world, and the palace remains behind, still silent, needing no surveillance of you. It does not have to. What needed to be planted was planted in the time you spent inside. And even if you cannot name what has changed, you know you have just stepped out of a place built not only of stone and wood, but of intention. In that very small moment when you walk faster, speak louder, breathe deeper, you touch the most delicate truth of Victorian power, that the greatest influence is not the thing that holds you back, but the thing that follows you quietly after you have already left. In the stillness of stone and wood, of high ceilings and long corridors, there is no climax, no shocking revelation, only a quiet realization that in the Victorian era, power was not only spoken or organized, it was built. And once it was built firmly enough, it no longer needed to move. It only needed to be there so that people would adjust themselves around it day after day, as if this were the only way the world could ever function. In the Victorian world, there were people who never had to ask where they belonged. And there were people who spent their entire lives living with a single question, whether they would be allowed to step inside. The answer did not lie in money alone, and it did not lie entirely in bloodline. It lay in the ritual of presentation, a sequence of actions that appeared formal and dignified, yet in truth was one of the era's coldest and most precise social filters. Imagine the moment before a presentation begins. There is no guiding music, no resonant introduction announcing that something important is about to take place. There is only waiting a stretch of time long enough to make everyone acutely aware of themselves. The invited stand in antechambers where the light is softer, where the space is designed so that no one becomes the center. There is no privileged viewpoint there, no prominent position. Every gaze floats, refusing to cling to another for too long. In those rooms, people do not talk much. Not because they have nothing to say, but because saying too much is a risk. Every story can reveal too much. Every laugh can arrive at the wrong moment. Every remark, even accidental, can be placed into a different context once it leaves this room. And in the Victorian world, being remembered is not always a good thing. To be remembered is to have left a trace. And to leave a trace is to become measurable, therefore judgeable. That waiting is not empty. It is heavy with what has not yet happened. People adjust their posture unconsciously, a little straighter, a little slower. Hands are placed in safe positions. Eyes avoid meeting too long, yet also avoid looking careless. Here, even appearing too comfortable is a mistake, because comfort means forgetting where you are. Sound in the room feels compressed. Each small footstep rings clearer than it needs to. Even a soft cough can make someone glance up for a moment, then quickly look away. No one wants to become the source of attention. No one wants to be the reason the room's atmosphere shifts, even for a few seconds. And so people learn to exist more lightly, as though their own weight could be adjusted by will. Time in these waiting rooms moves by a different rhythm. There is no large clock for everyone to share. No one says, "How much longer?" Uncertainty becomes part of the experience, a quiet test of endurance. Who can wait without showing impatience? Who can stand still without revealing tension? In this world, the ability to control one's expression matters as much as any connection. Some look around and ask themselves in silence whether they are standing in the right place. Some replay every instruction they were given, how to bow, how to step forward, how to step back. These thoughts are never spoken. They exist inside like a layer of sound no one can hear. And it is precisely that layer, the hidden anxieties, that fills the room more than any conversation ever could. The moment before the presentation begins is not preparation for an action. It is preparation for assessment. No one says you are being assessed, but everything around you suggests it. The soft light, so no one stands out. The balanced space, so no one dominates. The silence just enough for each person to hear their own breathing. In that state, people become more sensitive to detail and therefore easier to shape. And then when the door into the main space finally opens, the waiting ends without a clear signal. No announcement, no sudden shift. Only a faint movement in the air, a cue sufficient for everyone in the room to understand that the decisive moment has arrived. And they step forward, carrying a silence they have practiced carefully, ready to be seen, but only to the degree the ritual permits. The clothing has been prepared long in advance, not in the rush of the last minute, but in slow consideration, sometimes stretched across weeks, even months. Every detail is chosen with the same quiet question: will it disrupt the order? Not a question of beauty, not a question of novelty, a question of dissolution, whether the wearer can enter that space without forcing the space to adjust itself. Dress within the ritual of presentation is not allowed to express personality too clearly, but it is also not allowed to become completely invisible. It must exist in a fragile middle distance, proper enough not to attract negative attention, correct enough not to be seen as disrespectful, and neutral enough not to pull the eye toward itself. A skirt of the right length, not shorter to avoid being judged. Bold, not longer, to avoid appearing ostentatious. Gloves that cover the hands not only as a sign of politeness, but to eliminate unconscious gestures, the small movements that can reveal tension or temperament. Color is chosen by the same logic. Not too bright, so it does not become an unwanted focal point. Not too dull, so it is not interpreted as careless. Safe tones tested by time are preferred not because they are more beautiful, but because they are less risky. In the Victorian world, the greatest risk is not failing to impress, but impressing in the wrong way. Every fold of fabric, every cut is considered in relation to the space where it will appear. Clothing does not exist independently. It is part of the overall composition, a small element in the larger picture of ceremony. If a dress is too stiff, it makes noise when moving. If a fabric is too soft, it catches light in an unwanted way. And these seemingly tiny things can interrupt the orderly flow the presentation is meant to maintain. In a presentation, you do not come to be seen as an individual. You come to be confirmed. And that confirmation does not come from being remembered, but from not needing to be remembered. To be accepted means you dissolve into the common order so thoroughly that you create no roughness at all. No one has to shift position because of you. No one has to change the rhythm because of you. No one has to glance back to check what you are doing. It is a form of existence, very different from what we are used to, a form in which success is measured by how little inconvenience you cause. In that context, clothing becomes the most powerful tool for achieving controlled invisibility. It covers over differences that are too obvious, blurs personal markers, and places the wearer into an intermediate state, unremarkable yet not fully erased. There is a quiet tension in preparing clothing this way, because you must be present, but you must not take up space. You must be seen, but you must not become the center. You must prove that you belong here, but you must not force the place to change, because you are there. And in the Victorian world, reaching that balance is not instinct. It is a social skill learned early. When you enter the presentation wearing clothing weighed so carefully, you carry not only fabric and color, but a wordless message that you understand the rules, that you respect the order, and that you are willing to place yourself exactly where the ritual has already made room for you. In that moment, clothing is no longer an outer shell. It becomes a silent pledge that you will not make anyone adjust because of you, and therefore you deserve to remain. When the door opens, no one urges you to move quickly. On the contrary, everything forces you to slow down. Your pace no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the space, to the ritual, to a sequence rehearsed hundreds of times before. You step forward. You stop, you bow. Everything unfolds in an order so precise that if you do it correctly, no one notices. And if no one notices, that is success. The most frightening aspect of the presentation ritual does not lie in its solemnity, but in its calmness. No one shouts if you make a mistake. No one drives you out. You only feel a slight shift, a pause held a fraction too long, a gaze that does not stay long enough, a backward step that is not met with an invitation to move forward. And you understand without anyone saying it that you have touched the invisible boundary of permission. In the Victorian era, presentation was not merely a door into court. It was a door into social existence. A person correctly presented is not only seen within a palace, they are acknowledged in drawing rooms, gatherings, marriages, and business ties. Their name begins to appear on guest lists. Their absence begins to be noticed. And with that alone, their position in society changes. By contrast, a person who does not pass the ritual does not vanish immediately. They still live, still work, still exist somewhere. But they remain outside the center, a place with no clear punishment, yet no chance to draw nearer. They are excluded not by words, but by organized silence. No invitations, no questions, no explanations. What makes this system durable is that it rarely needs force. Most people exclude themselves before they are officially excluded. The fear of doing something wrong, the fear of attracting attention at the wrong moment, the fear of breaking an order they do not fully understand. Those fears teach people to regulate themselves until the ritual is no longer an external barrier, but an internal boundary. In presentation, no one asks who you are. That question has already been answered by the invitation, by sponsorship, by the quiet web of relationships behind the scenes. The presentation confirms only one thing: whether you can enter the existing order without making it tremble. If you can, you are allowed to exist at the center. If you cannot, the door closes, not loudly, not decisively, but permanently. There is something rarely said, and perhaps rarely admitted. Plainly, the presentation ritual does not measure human worth. It is not designed to discover who is more intelligent, who is more compassionate, or who can contribute more to society. It does not care about the inner story of your life, what you have endured, or what you might become. What it measures coldly and precisely is the ability to comply. In that space, excellence is not an advantage. It can become a danger. Too intelligent, and you may speak more than necessary. Too creative, and you may break the pattern. Too striking, and you may reveal a personality the order does not know how to handle. The presentation ritual does not seek exceptional individuals. It seeks suitable ones, those who can step into an existing order without disturbing it. That suitability is not mediocrity. It demands a different kind of intelligence, the intelligence of reading context, of knowing when to step forward and when to stop, of feeling limits that are never drawn in words. A suitable person knows how to make themselves smaller at the right moment, how to hold silence when silence is expected, how to turn their personality into something that does not obstruct the common flow. In a society that treats order as the foundation of stability, everything is judged through that lens. Order requires predictability. Stability requires repetition, and both treat overt difference as a latent threat. Therefore, suitability, the ability to blend in without making ripples, is valued above personal talent. You may be gifted, but if that gift forces the system to adjust, it will be seen as a problem, not a value. Presentation in this way functions as a very particular test. It does not ask, "Who are you?" It asks, "Can you become part of this without making it change?" If the answer is yes, you are accepted. If not, the door closes, not by moral judgment, but by administrative silence. What makes the mechanism so enduring is that it never claims to be unjust. It excludes no one by words. It merely prioritizes order. And when order is treated as the prerequisite for everything else, for safety, for honor, for the continuation of society, then sacrificing individual personality becomes a reasonable price. People learn to accept it, not because they believe it is right, but because they believe it is necessary. Over time, this standard sinks so deep that many stop questioning it. They begin to evaluate themselves by their capacity to fit. Did I speak at the right moment? Did I stand in the right place? Did I dress at the right degree? Self-worth becomes tied to how little disturbance one causes the common order. And once that happens, ritual is no longer an external event. It becomes an internal measure. That is the quiet power of Victorian presentation. It does not need to declare who is worthy. It only needs to create a space where suitability is rewarded and everything else automatically retreats. In that world, order wins not by crushing the individual, but by making the individual believe that dissolving into order is the safest way to exist. Presentations end without applause. There is no celebratory moment. People leave by the route already set. No one looks back because looking back is a sign of hesitation, and hesitation is not welcomed at the center of power. The only thing that remains is a vague feeling that something has been decided, though no one states what that decision is. And from that day onward, the life of the person who has been presented begins to change in small ways. Invitations arrive more often. Gazes rest a little longer. Their name is spoken with a different certainty. There is no proclamation, no official statement, only the gradual adjustment of the world around them, as though everyone has received the same invisible notice. For those who do not pass through that door, life continues to, but on a different rhythm mentioned less invited, less expected, less. Not because they did anything greatly wrong, but because they were not confirmed. And in the Victorian world, confirmation is as essential as existence. Society does not always need to say who has been excluded. Sometimes silence is enough. And the presentation ritual, with all its ceremonial dignity, is precisely how the Victorian era decided gently yet durably who would be allowed to enter its social history and who would remain outside the door forever. Key. It was not a drawing room as a place for free conversation, but a drawing room as a carefully staged set where intimacy was performed with a very specific purpose. In the Victorian era, the royal family did not simply live together. They were seen living together, and that act of being seen became a new form of power. Imagine a quiet afternoon, no grand ceremony, no presentation, no doorway sorting who may enter and who must remain outside. Only a familiar image, parents, children, an ordinary moment that seems to carry no political meaning at all. But in the Victorian world, no image was neutral. Every image could become a message. And the most powerful message of that time was not the strength of the throne, but the stability of the family. Before the Victorian era, royalty was often regarded as distant figures, silhouettes set above everyday life, surrounded by ritual bloodline and distance. They existed more as symbols of power than as specific human beings, with habits, emotions, and a private life. The public knew them through coronations, military victories, or solemnly announced decrees. Between those moments, the monarchy almost vanished from the social field of view, leaving behind the sense that power was something far away, very high up, and not something that needed to be explained. But the world was changing, and that change did not begin inside the palace. It began out there on the streets, in factories, in new neighborhoods, rising around cities that were swelling by the day. Industrialization disrupted the old rhythms of life. Urbanization pressed people closer together than ever before, not only in physical space, but in the shared experience of labor poverty and instability. And the mass press, with an unprecedented speed of circulation, began carrying images, stories, and even rumors farther than any ritual ever could. In that context, old power became easier to question. Not because it had weakened institutionally, but because it was being seen more often. When people read the same newspaper, heard the same stories, and compared their own lives to what was being presented, the distance between symbol and reality began to show cracks. A power that felt too distant became difficult to understand. And in a new age, a power that is difficult to understand is a power that is easy to suspect. The monarchy therefore faced a problem it had never faced before. It could not return to an era of absolute mystery. It could not continue relying solely on ritual and tradition to hold its position. The world had changed the way it looked, and if power wished to endure, it had to change the way it narrated itself. In that situation, the royal family needed a new language, a language that did not widen distance, but narrowed it. a language that did not speak of absolute difference, but of shared ground. And they found that language not in law, not in charters or political declarations, but in family life. Family was something every social class could understand, whether they lived in a palace or in a cramped home in an industrial city. Images of parents and children shared meals, attachment and order within a private space. These were familiar, easily felt, and difficult to refute. When the monarchy appeared in the role of a family, it no longer represented only the state or an abstract form of authority. It began to represent a model of life. This transformation did not happen through a public announcement. It happened gradually through curated images, through stories retold through the monarchy, allowing the public to see a portion of its private life, but only the portion deemed appropriate. In that process, power did not disappear. It changed shape. From a power built on distance, it became a power built on familiarity. From enforced reverence, it shifted toward emotional consent. And that was the crucial turning point of the Victorian era. The monarchy did not abandon its power. It learned to translate it into a language the new society could absorb, a language requiring no long explanations, no complex rituals, only images close enough to make people feel that in a world changing too fast, there was still a stable center, familiar, reliable, and worthy of trust. In that choice, choosing family as language, the monarchy found a way to endure, not by standing apart from a society in transformation, but by stepping quietly into its inner life, steadily, persistently, and convincingly enough that power no longer had to defend itself with words. The model family of the Victorian era did not appear by accident. It was the result of deliberate selection. The image of devoted parents, obedient children, and orderly private life, each element stood in contrast to the turbulence outside. As society became unstable, the picture of a stable family became an anchor. And when the monarchy placed itself in the position of that anchor, it no longer needed to speak about power. Power was felt as reassurance. There is a subtle paradox at the center of this story. A family by nature is the most private space a person has, the place where social roles loosen, where emotions are allowed to surface, without strict control, where imperfection is accepted as a natural part of life. Family is where people do not need to perform, at least that is how we usually think of it. But in the Victorian era, the royal family was placed in an entirely different position. It was no longer a space belonging only to those inside. It became a public space opened but never completely, seen but always within a frame, shared but only in the manner the court allowed. Privacy did not vanish. It was managed. Not every moment was displayed. On the contrary, most family life remained hidden. But it was precisely that selection that mattered. Only suitable moments were brought into the light, moments that reinforced the broader story of order, unity, and stability. A quiet afternoon with the children. A family gathered together. A gesture of care captured at the right time. Moments of fatigue, tension, or conflict remained behind closed doors, not because they did not exist, but because they did not serve the purpose. In this way, the royal family became an edited version of family life. Not a lie, but a selection. Not a fiction, but an arrangement. Intimacy was allowed to appear, but only to the degree that its interpretation could be controlled. A hug was no longer merely a hug, it was a message. A smile was not only for the person in the room, it was for eyes far away, people searching for a sign that order still held. Intimacy, therefore, was no longer entirely intimate. It became part of a structure of performance, not performance as spectacle, but performance as repetition and consistency. The royal family performed stability performed generational continuity, performed the feeling that there existed an unchanging center in a world rapidly shifting. And because what was performed drew on familiar elements, affection, care, responsibility, it was easy to accept and difficult to doubt. What is striking is that through this process, the boundary between truth and performance blurred. The moments chosen for public view were not necessarily fake. They could be entirely genuine. But once they were placed within a fixed frame, repeated and reaffirmed, they began to carry meaning beyond the moment itself. They became symbols, and symbols by nature serve an order larger than themselves. Family lifted from a private space into a public standard began to do something else as well. It started shaping how people lived. Society looked at the royal family and learned how to judge itself. Those who resembled the image were seen as stable, trustworthy. Those who deviated from it began to feel pressure, even when no condemnation was spoken. That paradox between private and public, between intimacy and performance, is the key to understanding the strength of the Victorian family model. The monarchy did not need to impose morality. It only needed to exist as an example, and an example repeated long enough becomes self-evident. Once the self-evident is accepted, power no longer needs to assert itself. It has already been installed deep inside how people understand family order and their own lives. The earliest paintings and photographs, carefully preserved, do not show the chaos of family life. They show order positions, arranged gazes, adjusted distances, calibrated close enough to signal unity, but not so close as to break dignity. Each image becomes a wordless lesson in how a family is supposed to exist. The important thing is this: the image was not created merely for the public to glance at and forget. It was not a one-time display. Over time, the royal family image seeped into social life and began to function as a norm, an unspoken reference point people used to measure themselves. No one turned it into law. No one declared it the only way to live. Yet through steady repetition, it became what one should have, what was desirable. Society looked at the royal family and learned to evaluate itself not through grand questions of power and politics, but through ordinary comparisons. Is my family close enough? Is order in my household clear enough? Am I living in a way that matches the image of a stable family? Those questions slipped into daily life, into how people defined success, failure, and even self-worth. Family, once a private unit, slowly became a moral yardstick, not a morality taught by sermons, but a morality inferred from images. A close family came to mean a good family. An orderly family came to mean a trustworthy one. And in reverse, families that did not fit the image, more unstable, more complex, less controlled, began to be viewed with quiet suspicion, even when no accusation was spoken. Attachment in that context was no longer merely an emotion. It became a sign of stability. And stability in an era shaken by industrialization, urbanization, and rapid social change became the highest value. When work was no longer secure, when traditional communities were disrupted, when old rhythms could no longer hold their shape, people searched for an anchor. Family shaped in the royal mold became that anchor. And when that happened, the monarchy no longer needed to affirm its authority through grand ceremonies or political declarations. It did not need to say it was the center of order. That order was already being mirrored in the daily lives of millions of families. Every time a household tried to live properly, it unintentionally reaffirmed the model the monarchy represented. Power, therefore, was maintained not by top-down force, but by bottom-up repetition. The monarchy only needed to model, not in a flamboyant way, but in a persistent one, appearing steadily as a stable family, keeping the image consistent across years, avoiding major disruptions that could fracture the shared narrative. And that consistency, undramatic, unflashy, is precisely what made the model credible. There is a special power in only needing to model. It does not provoke resistance because it does not command anyone to follow. Yet it produces normative pressure because it quietly defines what is normal, what is right. When people voluntarily adjust their lives to move closer to that image, power has done its work without having to appear as power. That is the moment when the Victorian monarchy reached a rare kind of authority. An authority that no longer needed defending because it had been internalized. No longer the power of the crown, but the power of the norm. No longer the power of orders, but the power of example. Once power operates this way, it does not need to speak loudly. It only needs to continue existing, steady, familiar, and close enough that people believe it is the most natural choice in a world full of upheaval. In that drawing room, power changed shape. It no longer stood upright, issuing commands or sorting people into categories. It sat down, smiled, and was invited into ordinary life. It became more familiar, and therefore harder to doubt. When you feel you share something with a symbol, you are less inclined to question its legitimacy. There is something rarely said: the model family is also a mold. It defines what is right and what is off. It does not punish those who do not fit, but it creates a standard whose pressure everyone can feel. Within that framework, other forms of family, less stable, less orderly, are pushed toward the margins, not by condemnation, but by silent comparison. The monarchy as a model family became the center of a new value network. It did not represent only the state, it represented the correct way to live. And when power represents a way of living, it sinks into personal life, into how people love, how they raise children, how they judge themselves. That is a form of power extraordinarily difficult to resist because it does not arrive as coercion, but as a gentle suggestion. In the quiet afternoons captured on record, there is no obvious sign of strategy. No one stands there announcing a plan. Yet strategy is present not in any single action, but in repetition. Repetition of images, repetition of stories. Repetition of the message that order begins in family, and a good family is the foundation of a good society. And when that message is repeated long enough, it no longer looks like a message at all. It becomes self-evident. The self-evident does not need defending or explaining. It only needs to continue. That is when power reaches its most stable state, when it dissolves into daily life, when people protect it not from obligation, but from belief. The Victorian royal family did not need to declare itself a moral exemplar. It only needed to appear steadily in that role. And a society hungry for certainty amid dizzying change accepted that image as an anchor. When night falls and the drawing room returns to its silence, the story of the model family continues to spread, not through words, but through memory, through images, through norms passed from one generation to the next. Family no longer functions only as the place people return to after a long day. It becomes a symbol of order. And once order is placed at the heart of personal life, power no longer needs to stand outside and rule. It is already inside, close, familiar, like a warm room where people believe they are staying by choice. Imagine a late evening. The palace has settled. The vast rooms no longer hold the sound of footsteps. The day's rituals have finished their work and withdrawn, giving way to a different stretch of time, never entirely private, but less watched. There, under softened lamplight, a person sits down at a writing desk. No audience, no staging, only blank paper ink and a voice that no longer needs to be held quite so tightly. In the Victorian era, Private correspondence was where speech was allowed to exist in an entirely different way. Not speech standing before the public, weighed beat by beat, so it would not disturb the larger order. Not sentences burdened with representing a dynasty, a symbol, or an entire value system. Here language is released from the stage. It does not need to be loud enough to be heard. It only needs to be precise enough to reach the right person. Unlike a speech, unlike a ritual, a letter does not aim at the crowd. It aims at one specific individual within one specific relationship, and that specificity changes everything about how language is used. Words do not need to be vague in order to avoid being misread by many people at once. They can be straighter, slower, even unfinished. Things that cannot be said in public because they are too private, too hesitant, or too fragile can exist on the page without breaking the order outside. In those letters, the voice comes closer. The ceremonial rhythm falls away. The rigid structure of official declarations disappears. The writer allows themselves to pause mid-sentence, return to an earlier thought, or mention details that carry no political value but hold human value. A wave of exhaustion, a sleepless night, a worry that cannot quite be named. When such things appear in a letter, they do not require society's consent. They only require reception. Here the sentences are not always perfect, and it is precisely that imperfection that creates their worth. There is no pressure to strike the right tone, to inhabit the right role, to meet the right expectation. A writer can try a phrasing and abandon it. They can place a thought on the page, then contradict it in the very next line. Correspondence allows hesitation to exist, something exceedingly rare in the public life of power. What matters is this: these letters do not seek to impress. They do not need to persuade. They do not need to be remembered. They only need to arrive at the right person, at the right moment, with the right nuance. And once they arrive, they complete their task, even if no one else ever knows they existed. In a Victorian world, where every public action carries symbolic weight, private correspondence becomes one of the few spaces where a person can speak without having to represent. Not representing the throne, not representing morality, not representing order, only representing the relationship between two people, even if that relationship still contains beneath its surface deep layers of influence. And for that reason, letters are not merely a means of communication. They are the system's pressure valve. What cannot be said before the crowd is placed into sealed envelopes. Questions without answers are written down so they can be seen more clearly. Emotions that do not fit ritual are set onto paper where they can exist without causing disturbance. But correspondence is not an escape from power. It is part of how power sustains itself. By allowing another kind of speaking to exist, the system avoids being compressed beyond its limits. Thoughts are processed here so that tomorrow out there everything can continue as before, stable, orderly, with no cracks showing. Here words do not need to live long. They do not need to be quoted. They do not need to be carved into stone. And yet, ironically, the words that only needed to arrive are often the words that remain the longest stored, reread, folded into historical memory later on. When that happens, they carry a different voice, smaller, slower, but more truthful, reminding us that even in an era of ritual and performance, power still needs moments to speak like a human being. And yet, even in that privacy, nothing is entirely free. These letters are not written in innocence. The writer knows paper can be kept. A letter can be reread. And memory once recorded can outlive the hand that wrote it. That is why private correspondence becomes a very particular space where feeling and historical awareness coexist on the same page. What makes Victorian letters important is not shocking secrets. Most letters reveal nothing dramatic. They speak of health schedules, ordinary worries. But it is precisely that ordinariness that matters, because it shows that power, when it does not need to perform, still meets the same limits every human being meets. In those letters, the voice truly changes. It loses the smooth, polished rhythm of ceremony. It loses the completed sentences designed to stand firm under many eyes. Instead, the voice slows down as if the writer is finally allowing themselves to think while writing, rather than thinking first and only then setting the thought down. Closeness appears not through grand confessions, but through rhythm. Short lines interwoven with long ones, ideas circling back repeated in slightly altered phrasing, not from a lack of control, but because the writer is testing which version sounds most faithful to the feeling inside them. In correspondence, repetition is not a flaw. It is the mark of a thought still unstable, still searching for support. Sometimes hesitation becomes unmistakable, not through blunt admissions, but through sentence structure. Subordinate clauses begin and then break off. Words are chosen, then replaced. On the page, that hesitation does not have to be hidden. It is allowed to exist as part of the process of translating feeling into language, a process that is never perfect. The pauses in the space of a letter are no longer filled in by order. In ritual, silence is managed. One knows when to be silent, how long, and what the silence means. But on the page, silence appears as real emptiness. A blank line between paragraphs, a thought that ends sooner than expected, a sentence not immediately followed. Those gaps carry what language cannot bear. There, the writer does not try to erase emotion. They try to limit it, place it into words so it does not spill outward, does not rupture the relationship, does not trigger consequences they are not ready to face. Writing in that sense becomes a delicate act of balance between speaking and not speaking, between revealing and holding back. Emotion in Victorian correspondence rarely arrives as explosion. It arrives as gentle pressure, a recurring sensation, a worry left unnamed, a desire to be acknowledged without demanding an immediate reply. And that careful handling of emotion, slow, deliberate, reflects a world where showing too much could produce unwanted tremors. On paper, the voice does not need to be consistent. It can contradict itself from one paragraph to the next. One line conveys certainty, the next reveals doubt. Those contradictions are not edited away to create a flawless image. They are left there as evidence that the person behind the role still exists, thinking, feeling, trying to arrange an inner world. And it is precisely those human traces, pauses, hesitation, repetition, that make correspondence such a singular space. Not where power collapses, but where power lowers its voice. In that space, power does not need to prove anything. It only needs to continue honest enough to listen to itself before tomorrow returns with a voice once again controlled, rounded, and ready to step back into public light. There are things that are never said in public, yet appear naturally in letters. Not as confession, but as acknowledgement, acknowledging exhaustion, acknowledging anxiety, acknowledging that some days keeping everything proper is a burden. Those acknowledgments do not weaken power. On the contrary, they reveal the price that must be paid for power to keep running smoothly the next day. Correspondence is also where relationships become clearer. In ritual, people appear in roles. In letters, roles blur, giving way to real emotional distance. Who writes more? Who replies faster? Who chooses silence? Those seemingly small details reveal a network of influence more subtly than any diagram of authority ever could. But something matters deeply. Here, private correspondence is not merely where power rests, it is where power is reset. Thoughts are tested here before they become action. Feelings are processed here before being placed back into the frame of ritual. Unripe decisions are set onto paper to be viewed from a safer distance before stepping into public light. In that way, letters become an essential part of the machine of power. Not the main mechanism, but the fine calibration and area for release, for slower thought, for allowing contradictions to exist without requiring immediate resolution. And the existence of such a space is precisely what enables public power to keep its appearance of stability. What is rarely said is that not every letter is preserved by accident. Archiving correspondence is also a conscious act. Some letters are kept carefully, some are removed, and some are left in an unfinished state, as if they were saved not to tell a complete story, but to guide how that story will later be understood. Because history is not written only by what happened, it is written by what is allowed to remain. A private letter, once placed in an archive, is no longer private. It becomes a document. And a document, no matter how honest, always exists inside a context of selection, who is allowed to read it when and for what purpose. Those questions determine how the voice of the past will sound in the present. In the Victorian era, memory was not controlled by total erasure. There are no abrupt voids, no forced silences so strained they become suspicious. Instead, memory is managed by selection far more subtle and therefore far more durable. The question is not what must be forgotten. The question is what should be remembered and in what way. The letters that are kept are not random. They are pieces that fit the larger story the reign wishes to tell about itself. Lines about duty, responsibility, devotion to role, these are preserved with care. They reinforce the image of a stable power, conscious of obligation, willing to place order above personal feeling. When such letters are read later, they need no lengthy explanation. They say on their own what history wishes to emphasize. But what is notable is this: letters that show weakness are not entirely removed. They remain stored aloud into shared memory, but within a very specific frame of interpretation. Fatigue is not read as doubt. Anxiety is not read as insecurity about legitimacy. Instead, these traces are presented as evidence of dedication, that power carries burdens so heavy the person behind it cannot help but feel tired. In that way, weakness does not break the narrative. It makes it more human without making it dangerous. A drop of worry placed in the right spot does not fracture the image, it deepens it. And when that depth is controlled, memory becomes more persuasive, not less. This selection also determines what need never be said outright. No preserved letter asks foundational questions about the order itself. No line allows doubt to spread beyond the private relationship. Thoughts that might shake the larger narrative, if they ever existed, are not left behind in a form that can live long. Not because they are wiped clean, but because they are not granted a durable shape. Memory, therefore, is not a neutral storehouse. It is a designed space. Every letter that remains has passed a silent test. Can it exist without tilting the axis of the story? If yes, it stays. If not, it disappears not as crude suppression, but as directed forgetting. When later historians open those drawers, they do not read a bare past. They read a past whose breathing has been arranged, a past that allows emotion, but only to the degree that it does not threaten order. A past that allows the human to appear, but always as devotion, never as destabilizing reflection. And that is what makes Victorian memory so difficult to grasp. It is not deceit in a blunt sense. It does not reverse truth. It simply says enough to create belief, enough to sustain the image, enough to make the reader feel they have seen the person behind power, while never quite touching the questions that could loosen the structure. Such memory does not only recount the past, it teaches the reader how to feel the past. And when feeling is guided, power no longer needs to exist in the present. It has already entered history not as something to be judged, but as an order that once existed, reasonable, necessary, and therefore difficult to question. That balance is precisely what turns correspondence into a very particular kind of myth. Not a myth of heroes or victories, but a myth of human beings working to keep order alive. People writing letters at night, knowing that in the morning they will step back into their roles, speak what must be spoken, keep silent where silence is required. When you read those letters or even hear them described, you do not see power collapsing. You see power repairing itself, adjusting, recalibrating, persuading itself that continuation is necessary. In that moment, power appears not as a fixed stone, but as an ongoing process, more fragile and yet more enduring. The night deepens, the last page is folded, the ink dries. The letter is slipped into an envelope carrying what does not need to be spoken before the public. The door of the writing room closes, and outside the palace stands still waiting for tomorrow, when ritual returns, when roles are worn again, when power continues to speak through its silence. Under soft lamplight and the faint movement of paper, there is no revelation that reshapes history. No secret large enough to break the order. Only a quiet recognition that behind every public image of stability, there is always a space where power must speak to itself through letters not meant for the stage, yet still shaping how the stage will be built the next day. In the Victorian world, there is a profound paradox. Power is not only reinforced when it is present, sometimes it is strongest precisely when it withdraws. Mourning is the clearest expression of that paradox, not as a moment of private feeling, but as an extended condition of authority in which absence is organized, made visible, and respected as part of the order itself. In this context, mourning does not begin with tears. It does not originate in a sudden emotional rupture, not in crying, not in the private collapse of an individual. It begins with ritual, the most familiar language of Victorian power. Before grief is even fully felt, it has already been given shape. It begins with the timetable changing. Appointments are postponed indefinitely. Planned ceremonies are canceled or reduced. Movements that were once carefully choreographed are suspended with little need for explanation. Time in this state no longer flows in its usual rhythm. It is slowed deliberately, not because society cannot continue to function, but because it is being asked to adjust its breathing. At the same moment, clothing changes color. Black, deep violet tones that refuse to reflect light gradually settle over public space. This is not a personal aesthetic choice. It is a visual signal, clear, repeated everywhere on bodies, in rare public appearances, in the minimal rites that still go on. The color does not require interpretation. It speaks in place of language. A different state has begun. Space changes with it. Light is restrained. Sound is softened. Rooms once broad and echoing grow heavier, as though ceilings have lowered and walls thickened. Expressions of cheer and vitality retreat from public life, not through prohibition, but through the shared understanding that they are no longer fitting. Society learns to lower its voice as if stepping into a room where someone is sleeping. What is striking is that no one needs to issue an order for this slowing to occur. It happens through voluntary coordination. Individuals, institutions, public spaces all recalibrate themselves, not because they are forced, but because mourning is understood as a collective condition. And once that condition is shared, it becomes a new norm, even if only temporarily. Everything slows, but nothing falls into chaos. On the contrary, the slowing is meticulously organized. It has rhythm. It has limits. It has rules. Society does not enter absolute silence. It simply turns the volume down. It does not stop functioning. It shifts into restraint. And it is precisely that control that ensures mourning does not break order. It reinforces it. In this state, time takes on a different texture. Days pass without feeling like progress. Everything seems to stand still, waiting for something to end, waiting for a signal that allows the return to normal rhythm. And in that waiting, power does not need to appear to govern. It has already been written into the way people are behaving. Mourning, therefore, is a social transformation, not merely an expression of feeling. It silently restructures public life. It creates a controlled retreat in which pressures soften, conflicts are temporarily set aside. No one says now is not the time, yet everyone understands it. And that is why mourning becomes the most refined form of power. It does not demand obedience through commands. It asks only for emotional synchronization. When an entire society accepts that this is a time to slow down, authority achieves what no speech can. It makes people adjust their own behavior to a shared rhythm, quietly, orderly, and without needing to be reminded. When the royal family enters mourning, the entire system around them must recalibrate. There is no grand decree, no coercive proclamation, yet everyone understands that there are things no longer appropriate to say, demands no longer timely to raise questions that should be postponed. Mourning becomes an ethical suspension where power is protected not by argument, but by collective feeling. Royal absence during mourning is not read as abandonment. It is read as sacrifice of public presence, sacrifice of everyday ceremonial role. And that interpretation grants legitimacy to withdrawal. When power is absent because of grief, it does not need to explain itself. It does not need to defend itself. Any challenge becomes indecent, not because it is necessarily wrong, but because it violates the moral timing of the moment. In Victorian life, mourning never takes a vague shape. It is not a floating emotion without borders, without a clear endpoint. On the contrary, it is defined with precision, by time, by degree, by hierarchy. Who mourns for how long? At what level? With what restrictions of social engagement? Everything is known in advance, even before loss occurs. There are periods fixed with rigid clarity: deep mourning, light mourning, public mourning, private mourning. Each phase carries concrete behavioral changes, whether one may appear or not, how much one may speak, which social spaces one may enter. Time in mourning is no longer a natural stream. It becomes a structure, a sequence of steps society must walk through together. And the degrees are not equal. They reflect social position closeness and each person's role in the wider order. Some must withdraw completely. Some must simply restrain themselves. Some may still appear, but in a softened form. Mourning becomes a social map. Each individual knows where they stand and how they are expected to move within shared space. These restrictions are not designed to sever society. They are designed to regulate intensity. No one is compelled to total silence. Yet, everyone knows certain voices should quiet down. Certain stories should be set aside. Certain topics are no longer appropriate to open. Communication is not forbidden. It is filtered. And when that filtering happens collectively, society enters a state of speaking, less moving, slower acting with greater care, without anyone needing to remind them. These rules do more than show respect to the dead. They accomplish something far larger. They create a shared rhythm. When people adjust time behavior and language to an accepted pattern, society reaches a rare level of synchronization, not synchronization of opinion, but synchronization of state. And once a society shares a state power, no longer needs to appear to coordinate it. No speeches, no commands, no constant presence. Authority has been internalized, living in habit, in shared understanding, in each person's ability to know what to do without being told. This matters especially in a turbulent era. Industrialization reshapes daily rhythm. Urbanization increases friction. Political reforms create continual pressure. In that context, mourning functions as a break. It forces society to slow down at the same time instead of each group slowing in its own way. And that unified deceleration prevents instability from spreading. Mourning, then, is not a chaotic hush. It is an organized hush, a pause with shape-borders logic. It lets society breathe, but breathe in the same rhythm. And once breathing is synchronized, every movement that follows becomes easier to manage. These rules do not need to be newly imposed each time. They are learned, remembered, passed down through observation and habit. People know what to do, not because they fear punishment, but because failing to do it would feel out of rhythm. And being out of rhythm in the Victorian world is more dangerous than violating any single written regulation. Here, mourning reveals the deepest nature of Victorian power. Power does not reside in forcing others to obey, but in making everyone want to behave in the same way. Once that happens, authority does not need to stand at the center. It is spread through the system, becoming the ground of collective conduct. So mourning does not merely mark a loss. It marks a convergence, a moment when society is drawn back together in silence, restraint, and a temporary order heavy with meaning. And in that moment, power reaches its most perfect condition, present everywhere, without needing to appear anywhere. There is something crucial here, and if we miss it, we misread the entire mechanism of Victorian life. Mourning does not stop power. It does not halt the gears. It freezes power in a safe state, a state in which authority does not need to advance and does not need to defend itself. In that state, power does not disappear. It retreats from the zone of risk. It avoids making new decisions. It avoids direct confrontation with conflict. It avoids debates that could widen division. But this is not named avoidance. It is given a more acceptable, more human name, being in mourning. Mourning creates a legitimate pause in political flow, one that cannot be publicly opposed, because opposing it would mean denying grief. And in Victorian society, where emotional morality holds great weight, nothing is more damaging than being seen as someone who cannot wait, cannot respect the moment, cannot understand timing. In that time, every controversial decision can be postponed. No complex justification is needed. No elaborate argument. Only a soft sentence, "Now is not the time." That sentence does not close the door forever. It merely pushes the question farther away far enough that when it returns, the energy of resistance has weakened or the context has shifted. Difficult reforms, too, can be set aside not as failure, but as prudence. Mourning lets authority move from action into waiting without losing the image of responsibility. Indeed, that waiting can be read as maturity. There are things that should not be done, while collective feeling remains heavy. Here, time becomes the most valuable political resource, and mourning is how power buys time legally, without controversy, without leaving obvious fingerprints. No one can write "power delayed." They can only write "the moment was not appropriate." Notice this: in this frozen state, power is not weakened, it is preserved. The greatest threats to authority often come not from what is done, but from when it is done. Doing the right thing at the wrong time can provoke a stronger backlash than doing nothing at all. Mourning removes that risk by turning non-action into a moral choice. This pause also alters public expectation. People do not demand quick solutions. They do not insist on clear answers. Delay is no longer read as incapacity, but as necessity. And once expectation has been lowered, authority enters absolute safety. It can refrain from acting without being punished for it. Mourning becomes a buffer state. It absorbs tension, softens pressure, allows waves of dissatisfaction to pass without direct confrontation. While society focuses on loss, on ritual, on proper conduct, larger questions lose their urgency. They still exist, but they hang suspended, not close enough to strike power. In that time, memory begins to rearrange itself. What happened before mourning is seen under a different light, softer, more distant. Fierce disputes are blurred by the sense that we have just lived through something larger. Mourning does not only buy time, it changes how time is felt. And when mourning ends, when public presence gradually returns, the context is different. Not because the problems have been solved, but because it is no longer the same moment in which to solve them. Social energy has shifted. Demands that once felt immediate become harder to reignite. Authority returns to a landscape that has been flattened, softened, made safer than it was when it withdrew. So, mourning is not an interruption of power. It is a strategic phase. Power stands still, so it will not be forced into reaction. A state where not acting is not failure, but a careful choice protected by morality and ritual. Victorian power understood this with perfect clarity. Sometimes the safest way to survive is not to press forward, but to know how to stop at the right moment, and to name that stopping with a title no one dares to oppose. Absence also blurs the boundary between person and institution. When the royal family mourns, society does not see only a grieving individual. It sees an institution grieving. Private feeling is elevated into national feeling. And once feeling becomes a symbol, it becomes harder to challenge than any argument. In that context, to demand presence becomes inappropriate. To demand explanation becomes tactless. By withdrawing power, places itself on moral ground above dispute, not because it is more correct, but because it is enduring more. Mourning does something else even more subtle. It slows history. While the outside world accelerates, factories, rising cities, swelling social pressure, tightening the monarchy remains in non-movement. And that non-movement creates the sensation of continuity, something not swept away by change. A still axis around which everything else turns. Power in mourning does not need to be seen to be felt. It is present through what does not happen. The ceremonies canceled, the visits postponed, the audiences not held. Each non-event is a signal order is still there, strong enough to pause itself. For the public mourning also produces a standardized emotional frame. People learn how to grieve correctly, just enough with dignity, without excess, without turning sorrow into disorder. Emotion, like everything else in the Victorian world, is placed into form. And once emotion is made, orderly, power can move through it without resistance. Perhaps the most striking thing is that mourning is never presented as strategy. No one says this absence is necessary to maintain stability. No one calls it a tool of power. It is called by a thoroughly human name, grief. And by placing authority under the language of feeling Victorian power, becomes close difficult to suspect, almost impossible to oppose. Throughout mourning, authority does not vanish. It shifts into a background state less visible, but more enveloping. People adjust their behavior around the absence, and when adjustment lasts long enough, it becomes habit. Once habit forms, power has achieved its aim without needing to appear. Mourning, therefore, is not the silence of power. It is the height of silent power, a condition in which authority does not need to prove debate or command, only to be respected as self-evident. And when mourning ends, when presence slowly returns, power returns to a world that has been softened. Tensions have been dulled. Demands have been delayed. Questions have cooled, not because they were answered, but because the moment for asking has passed. In the Victorian world, absence is not emptiness. It is another form of presence, an authority that does not need a stage or language, yet is strong enough to make an entire society slow down, wait, and recalibrate itself until power decides that it is time to appear again. When the Victorian era drew to a close, there was no single unmistakable moment to signal that its world had vanished. No historical bell rang to announce an ending. No door slammed shut behind it, cleanly separating a before from an after. There was no final ritual to formally declare that an old order had fulfilled its role and yielded to a new one. Specific people passed away, names and faces bound to a particular age. Clothing changed, lines grew softer colors, lighter forms, less rigid. New technologies emerged, electricity engines, modern media accelerating the world's pace, making it louder, seemingly less patient with the slowness of old rituals. All of this created the impression that the Victorian era had receded into the past, becoming a closed chapter in history. But the way power functioned did not leave with them. It did not need to leave because it had never relied entirely on outward forms. It did not reside solely in crowns, palaces, or the grand ceremonies we often associate with Victorian imagery. The true power of that era existed elsewhere, in rhythm, in distance, in restraint, in the ability to sustain order without needing to constantly announce it. As concrete symbols faded, the underlying logic remained intact. Power continued to live on as habit, as norm, as familiar phrases such as "this is not the time that can wait," or "some things do not need to be said." It persisted in the way people adjusted their behavior before anyone asked them to, in the way society softened latent conflicts through silence and postponement. There was no sharp moment of transition because there was nothing that needed to be publicly handed over. Victorian power was never designed to collapse in a single day. It was designed to dissolve into the background so that when the era changed its name, the logic would still be there, no longer needing the same label. For this reason, the world after Victoria was not a world of rupture, but one of quiet inheritance. People continued to live, work, and organize society according to patterns they had learned earlier, sometimes forgetting their origins, sometimes unaware that they were repeating an old logic in a new context. Rituals were no longer called rituals. They became procedures, organizational culture, social norms. Power in this form no longer needed to appear as power. It did not need to assert itself through grand symbols or solemn declarations. It lived in familiarity, in the feeling that this is simply how things are. And when an order reaches that point, it no longer needs to defend itself. It has become part of how people understand the world. The Victorian era then did not end the way a dynasty ends. It settled. And in that settling, it left behind a legacy more durable than any monument, a way of thinking about power. Quiet, indirect, wrapped in order that continues to operate even after the name Victoria has faded from memory. Its greatest legacy does not lie in standing palaces or portraits hanging in museums. It lies in invisible habits that modern society still carries, often without realizing it. In how we understand proper conduct, in how we judge maturity, in how we accept that some things do not need to be spoken aloud. Victorian society taught a profound lesson, one never written into doctrine or proclaimed as principle, but practiced daily, that power does not need to appear as power in order to exist. It does not require a louder voice than others. It does not need imposing gestures. It does not need dramatic moments to assert itself. On the contrary, power often endures longest when it does not resemble power at all. It hides in schedules and when the day begins and ends in what comes first and what must wait. When time is prearranged, human behavior follows without command. People do not need to be forced to comply. They only need to move with the rhythm already set, because stepping out of rhythm feels like disruption. Power also hides in ritual, not in flamboyant ceremony, but in gestures repeated until they become invisible. How to stand, how to wait, how to open and close a meeting. These rituals do not say obey, yet they create an environment in which obedience feels natural. When everyone knows what to do, no one needs to say it. It hides in space, in the size of rooms, in the distance between people, in the placement of doors, chairs, and waiting areas. Space shapes the body before language intervenes. When you must look up lower, your voice slow, your pace power has already acted without ever naming itself. And power hides in daily rhythm, in what is always done this way, in habits that require no explanation, in the sense that some things are not worth questioning or debating. When order becomes embedded in everyday life, power is no longer something one confronts. It becomes context. Here, the durability of Victorian power reveals itself. Power placed within seemingly neutral things, time-space habit, does not provoke resistance. People can oppose an order. They can rage against a decision. But it is very difficult to rebel against a schedule or against the way things work. These neutral elements do not speak the language of politics. They do not demand conscious agreement. They require only adaptation. And humans, in order to survive socially, are always willing to adapt. When adaptation persists long enough, it no longer feels like concession. It becomes personal competence, the ability to fit in, to read situations, to maintain propriety. Thus, power does not need to be reinforced through violence or threats. It is reinforced through repetition, day after day, generation after generation, without needing to remember who designed it or why it exists. One simply continues to live within it. The Victorian era understood this well. A power that must constantly assert itself as power is never secure. Secure power is power accepted as self-evident, like the floor beneath one's feet, noticed only when it shakes. And so the deepest lesson the Victorian world left behind was not how to build a dynasty, but how to dissolve power into life itself. So that one day when people look around and ask where power is, the answer will be everywhere, yet nowhere clearly enough to point to and say, this is it. Today, we still live within systems governed by the same logic, though we rarely name it. Power in the modern world seldom appears as direct command. It does not need a harsh voice or authoritarian declarations. Instead, it speaks through processes, charts, forms, carefully numbered steps, and most importantly, through the familiar phrase, "This is how things have always been done." Within organizations, power does not ask you to agree. It asks you to comply. And compliance does not require belief, only adaptation to the system. Once everything is embedded in procedure, the question is no longer who decided this, but what is the next step. Process obscures the agent of power, making command appear as technical necessity. Modern meetings illustrate this perfectly. They occur regularly with schedules, agendas, precisely allocated time slots. Within such spaces, not all questions are forbidden. Yet some questions are never asked, not because they are wrong or dangerous, but because they do not fit the atmosphere, the timing, the level, or the scope of this meeting. Everyone understands this without being taught. Newcomers learn by observation. Veterans learn by experience. A question that once made a room fall silent will not be repeated. No one needs to say, "Don't ask that." Silence speaks for itself. Once the lesson is learned, power no longer needs to intervene. Concepts such as professionalism, constructive spirit, proper channels, and following procedure become the intermediary language of power. They sound neutral, even reasonable. And precisely because of that, they are effective. Opposing them does not feel like opposing a person. It feels like opposing how the system works a task, both exhausting and rarely rewarding. Modern power also hides in how time is allocated, how long an issue is considered urgent, how long a proposal takes to be reviewed, how long before a decision is made. When time is stretched, passion cools. When time is compressed, debate disappears. In both cases, power does not need to say no. It only needs to adjust the rhythm. As in Victorian times, questions deemed inappropriate for the level do not vanish from individual thought. They are simply not allowed into shared space. Each person carries the sense that something remains unsaid. Over time, that sense becomes familiar. And when familiarity is widely shared, it becomes organizational culture. Here, the Victorian legacy is unmistakable, not in archaic ceremony, but in power's ability to hide behind neutrality, process culture, and statements without clear authorship. Power does not say, "I decide." It says the system requires this. And when power speaks in the voice of the system, the question shifts from who controls this to is there any alternative, a far more difficult question to ask, and an even harder one to answer. We still regard self-control, knowing when not to speak, as a sign of competence. We still value those who maintain silence at the right moment more than those who voice discomfort. These standards did not arise naturally. They are cultural inheritances from a world that learned to maintain order through restraint rather than confrontation. Even our idea of privacy bears a Victorian imprint, not because the era celebrated individuality, but because it rigidly layered experience, what belongs in public, what may remain private, and what should exist only as feeling. That layering persists today, merely changing form. We still accept that some truths are unsuitable for public expression, that certain emotions should be processed elsewhere, that collective stability outweighs personal disclosure. These beliefs are rarely named, yet they shape how we live, work, and respond to power. This legacy extends beyond politics. It permeates education, media, workplaces, and intimate relationships. We learn to read the room, to adjust tone, to recognize that silence is often the safest choice. And when safety becomes the highest value, order sustains itself without coercion. The Victorian era also left us a profound lesson about continuity, a lesson not taught explicitly, but embedded in collective perception. In a world of industrial upheaval, urban expansion, and rapid scientific change, they created the feeling that some things did not change. These things did not need to be truly immutable. They only needed to feel that way. Ritual rhythms repeated, social roles retained familiar names, power structures kept stable shapes so people knew where they stood, and as everything else moved faster than human adaptation. This sense of continuity became psychological shelter. It brought reassurance not by solving problems, but by reducing anxiety. Believing that something remains intact makes change more bearable. Victorian society understood this deeply. They did not attempt to stop upheaval. They framed it with instability, so it would not become chaos. Ritual in this context was not mere form, it was a heartbeat amid disruption. Even as the outside world changed, ritual occurred on time, in order as expected. Its repetition sent a quiet, yet powerful message. Order still exists. Social roles functioned similarly. As class boundaries were tested and new paths of mobility emerged, Victorian society preserved familiar titles, positions, and expectations. Even as substance shifted form, maintained the illusion that the structure endured. Thus, power did not need constant assertion. It was reinforced by familiarity. When people know what comes next, they are less inclined to question foundations. Predictable rhythm, even amid instability, encourages continuation over reconsideration. This sense of continuity explains why later societies repeatedly sought to recreate Victorian spirit in moments of crisis. When facing upheaval, they return to ritual. When overwhelmed by speed, they seek stable forms. When anxiety spreads, they resurrect symbols of order, not because these solve problems, but because they make them bearable. This occurs not only at national scale, but within organizations, communities, and families. When the outside world trembles, people tighten familiar routines, regular meetings, unchanging procedures, preserved role titles. All echo the Victorian lesson that perceived stability can matter more than actual stability. Yet this lesson has a cost. When continuity becomes the supreme goal, necessary questions are postponed. Old structures are preserved not because they still serve, but because they feel safe. And when safety is prioritized too long, change, even when essential, becomes difficult. Still, the Victorian era grasped a deeply human truth. In times of upheaval, people seek not perfect solutions, but rhythms to hold on to. Through ritual role and continuity-oriented power, they created that rhythm slow enough, familiar enough for society to keep moving without collapse. Thus, the Victorian legacy lies not in resisting change, but in wrapping change within the feeling that order persists. A feeling that outlived the era itself and continues to shape how we face uncertainty today. Yet that legacy renders power difficult to perceive. Not because it vanishes, but because it blends into the background. When power becomes background, the question shifts from who commands to why do we do this at all. Victoria left us no final answer, only a method of existence. A way of organizing society where conflict is softened, discontent diffused, and change slowed sometimes to a standstill. This method can sustain long-term stability, but it can also delay questions that must eventually be asked. Looking back, the point is not to judge Victorian society as right or wrong, but to recognize what we have inherited. Which silences do we still maintain? Which rituals do we follow without remembering why? Which questions remain unspoken, not because no one thinks them, but because they have never been deemed the right moment. This final chapter ends without a decisive conclusion. It settles much like the Victorian spirit itself. A moment to realize that history lives not only in what happened, but in how we continue to live with what once existed. And perhaps, when the night grows quiet, when the noise of the present recedes just a little, you may ask without needing an immediate answer. In our world today, how many things are sustained not by words, but by silences so familiar that we no longer recognize them? And as we reach the final moments of this journey, perhaps what remains with you is not a name, not a specific ritual, nor the image of any particular palace, but something much quieter, a lingering sense that in the world of the Victorian British monarchy, power rarely needed to appear openly. It did not stand at the center of the room. It stood at the edges, in the observing gaze, in the schedule, in absences that were accepted without explanation. Some dynasties collapsed through war. Some regimes end in noise. But there are also eras that end by teaching an entire society how to lower its voice. And what is most striking is how much of that lesson still remains with us today, embedded in the way we dress when we enter a space considered formal, in the way we wait to be called by name, in the way we adjust our behavior, simply because we sense that here, this is how one is meant to be. If tonight you are listening to this story as your eyelids begin to grow heavy, you do not need to hold on to any conclusions. You do not need to remember every detail. You only need to keep that feeling that history is shaped not only by what happened, but also by what was never spoken aloud. And before you drift deeper into sleep, I want to ask you one last very simple question. Where are you listening from right now and where you are? What time is it? If you wish, you can leave a very short line. No explanation, no conclusion. Just a small sign that tonight you and I passed together through a very quiet stretch of history. I wish you a deep and peaceful sleep.